Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us for tonight's presentation, Pappyland, a story of family, fine bourbon, and the things that last. Wright Thompson is a senior writer for ESPN and the best-selling author of The Cost of These Dreams. He previously worked at the Kansas City Star and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. His writings cover a wide range of sports issues, including football, basketball, and baseball, car racing, sports history, Father's Day, and bullfighting. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wright Thompson.
It is certainly a pleasure to be here. And I've been to one of these things as a civilian. So on the other side of this, and the Filson Society does an incredible job. So I'm very honored to be on this side of the podium for once. As he said, my name's Wright Thompson. I have a book out called Pappyland, and it's a strange book. I think the people who've read it will probably agree, because part of it is the story of the Van Winkle family and Van Winkle Bourbon, and part of it is a story of the 4 years I spent with Julian, which we'll get into. And I hope at its core, really, it's a love letter to the state of Kentucky. They're long riffs on not just bourbon, but horses and really the landscape of Kentucky, which, and again, we'll get into, I think is a really important part of bourbon, frankly. First, a little bit about how this book came to be. Oh yeah, by the way, I got my Weller out tonight in honor. So cheers to everybody. Went in and got some good fine wheated bourbon. As people in Kentucky will know, there's a lot of wheat grown in Kentucky. There's almost no, there's so little rye grown. I don't think there's any rye grown. Somebody might grow it in their yard, but there's so little rye grown that the U.S. Department of Agriculture doesn't track it. But so I like wheated bourbons. I met Julian at a party in Atlanta, and I'm sure there are people here who know Julian and Sissy very well. They've become very close. They're incredible people. But I didn't know much about him other than I couldn't find his whiskey anywhere. And I sort of imagined that he was one of those guys who was sort of born on third base and thought he hit a triple, just inherited a whiskey empire. And, but he was fun. And that's the first thing I remember, is that he was really fun. And then I started talking to him and found out that he was really nice and thoughtful and, what's the best way to describe it? Sort of wise. This book came out, I don't know, in last November. And not that long ago, I had an interesting job opportunity. And, my father, as I write about in the book, has been dead a while. And Julian was the one I called to sort of talk it through. So he's become very, very important to me. But when I first met him, I just thought he was a guy who inherited a whiskey company. And the more time I started spending with him, the more I realized that wasn't true. I don't know how many people know the story of how Pappy Van Winkle came to be in that bottle. Some of you might. I'll give you the stripped down version a little bit. I don't want to bore anybody, especially a Kentucky audience that probably knows a lot of this, but the Stitzel-Weller distillery, which a lot of you, if you live in Louisville, you know where that is, opened on Derby Day 1935. And Julian's grandfather, Pappy Van Winkle, founded it. And he was he didn't make whiskey. He was a marketing genius. And that's interesting when you think about it. He was a very savvy businessman and a very savvy marketer who, when that place opened, even as they were selling bourbon that sort of, if you look at his old marketing campaigns, even in 1935, he was selling this as a drink of some better forgotten past. I mean, it doesn't really matter where in the arc of bourbon you go start looking. I mean, nostalgia is a thing that has always been a key part of it, of selling it. But when he opened this place up, it was the most advanced distillery in the world. I mean, they might have been selling some piece of a vanishing agrarian past, but the place they were making that was a factory. I mean, it was state of the art. And so at the time, I think it was the biggest still in the world they built. I mean, this was a cutting edge facility, and it was the Stitzel-Weller. And, bourbon heads will tell you that a lot of people think that they make the best whiskey that's ever been made. And they chugged along through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s when Julian's father started to take over the business. I don't know if there's anybody listening who knew Julian's dad, but I mean, he was, Julian always describes him as a tank commander, which he was. But I've always thought that was pretty telling about how, about the shadow he cast in Julian's life. And so he was a tough, burly guy, an athlete at Princeton, really smart guy, very good at the business, not as charismatic as Pappy, but few of us are. And so one of the things that was happening in the 1960s is that people stopped drinking bourbon. And there are a lot of reasons for this. There have been entire books written about it. I mean, one of the things that I love that, real whiskey historians talk about the James Bond effect, which I think is hilarious. Like the coolest guy in the world was drinking martinis, and suddenly everybody wanted to drink martinis. And then a lot of it was, bourbon was what your dad drank. Bourbon was Eisenhower, and, vodka was Joe Namath. There was a real, it really faded. I mean, the numbers were, it was like that. One of the things I always thought was subtle, mostly unknown, but a real testament to how much Julian's father felt about Pappy, his father. They knew they were going to have to cut the proof of it, both to sort of make the business math work and to try to sell it to a wider audience. And Julian's dad, I mean, I think he cut the proof of it off the top of my head. It's in the book, I think from 100 to 86.4, but he cut the proof of it on like his fourth day in charge. So, he just didn't want his father to have to suffer the indignity of that. And so he was, in charge of a business that was in decline. There was a hostile family takeover, and the Van Winkles lost. They sold the distillery. And so Julian's dad worked out a deal where he was going to start his own label, and the Stitzel-Weller, who were making the finest bourbon in the world, agreed to sell him barrels of it. And so he's just making this, and he doesn't do it very long. Julian talks about how the pain of losing the distillery really sort of undid his father, and he died. And so now Julian inherits this thing, except he can't get the whiskey that his dad got because he doesn't, they were doing it as sort of a favor to his dad. So now he has a label, but he has nothing to put in the bottles. And so Julian starts going out, sort of scrounging around, and he's getting barrels from here and barrels from there. It's interesting because he doesn't have to do this anymore. But one of Julian's great gifts is the ability to blend barrels together to make really great bourbon that sort of punches above its weight. And so, old Rip, that 10-year-old, became famous for being really great bourbon. And that's just a testament to Julian's palate. I mean, if you go talk to the scientist and the chemist over at Buffalo Trace, I mean, people talk about Julian's palate, and that's a very real thing. So he's chugging along, and they're not doing great. And that's where the story got really interesting to me, because Julian isn't somebody who inherited something. He is the third generation of a whiskey family, but he also has spent his life trying to start from scratch. I mean, he had a famous name, but he had this old facility out in what feels like a holler up in, is it Lawrenceburg, sort of out from Frankfurt. And, they're just out there scraping by. I went out there with him, and it was interesting because he clearly hadn't been there in a while. And it was amazing how much he remembered what a struggle that was. And, I've thought a lot about this. It was interesting because he had this really old bottling line, and, it would be like a Model T, like nobody knows how to fix them. But Mr. Russell up the road at Wild Turkey had some of these old guys who used to work for him who remembered how to fix this ancient bottling line. So when it would break down, he would send those guys from Wild Turkey to help Julian out, which I always felt really was a real window into what an insular family this bourbon world was. I thought a lot about Julian out there making this whiskey. And, I don't think he imagined that he would ever be where they are today. I mean, I don't think this is one of those sort of living the dream, belief one day we're going to be on top of the world. One day we're going to make it. Let's just keep grinding. I mean, I sort of think that it was I don't know what the right way to say this is. I think that he was just going down with the ship. I mean, I don't think the point was to make it. I think the point was this was the only life he'd ever known. And the idea wasn't even to win so much as it was to lose with honor and to not quit. And, that really spoke to me because, I mean, the implicit question in that is like, what do you owe your father and your mother? And what do you owe your grandfather and your grandparents? And what do you owe your ancestors? And that's when I really decided I wanted to do this, because I've been thinking about that a lot. And, right when this started, Julian had had a cancer scare, which he had just emerged from. But I mean, there was a moment where you didn't know. And my wife and I were really struggling to have kids. I just heard them pull up to our house. So in a minute, you might see running through that door proof that our journey turned out to be successful. But in that moment, we really didn't know. And so what I found was, as I drove to Kentucky over and over again, was that the most interesting and profound conversations to me that I was having with Julian were the ones we would have after we stopped talking about whiskey, because we were spending a lot of time chewing on those big questions, like, what do you owe your ancestors, and what is it important that you pass on to your children? I went and saw the Bruce Springsteen on Broadway thing, and one of the things he said that was really interesting was you can either be an ancestor to your children, or you can be a ghost. You can either help propel them to their own dreams and the things they want, or you can, and that's an ancestor, or you can be a ghost, and you and all of your problems and demons can wrap so tightly around their ankles that they just can't ever escape the gravitational pull of you. And so, as we struggled to have kids, and it's funny, like I mean, this is an aside, but you talk about how God works. We were in Paris, where I was covering the European soccer championships for ESPN. I work for ESPN, and we were over there, and Sonia was pregnant, and we really thought this was going to work. And then she had a miscarriage, and we were in Paris and don't speak French, trying to figure out what to do. And so I just texted the people we'd rented this apartment from. I'm like, hey, do you know like what to, can you come translate with us or something if we go to the ER? And he started laughing because he was one of the directors of the American hospital in Paris. And he was like, come with me. And he was a godsend. And like, didn't know that. It was totally random. But, we really struggled. And so I thought that if I wrote a book that was just about whiskey, and if I wrote a book about the time I was spending with the Van Winkles, and it didn't include and it wasn't the most interesting and profound and personally important version of that story, then I had failed. And so I started writing half the book about Julian and half the book about my family, and writing about the South, writing about Kentucky and Mississippi, where I'm from, and writing about the land, and writing about inheritance, and writing about, the dreams of our fathers that we carry on. And so that's how I really connected to the story of Julian and the story of his family and what they were doing. Because, Stitzel-Weller sold and then sold again. Diageo owns it now. Sorry if somebody on here is a Diageo executive. But they were just sort of morons. I mean, they had this incredibly valuable thing that wasn't super valuable at the time. They had a facility that made what almost everyone considered to be the world's best bourbon. They dismantled that facility. They switched from Pappy's living yeast, it was the same yeast, to a powdered yeast. And it wasn't really their fault. I mean, you ask anyone in the whiskey business, there are very few distilleries now where the accountants don't make the whiskey. I mean, the accountants always have more power than the master distillers. And, there are all sorts of, the tax code is written in such a way that there is the accountants demand it go into the barrels at a certain proof, even though a lower proof would make better whiskey. I mean, there's almost no instance where what's best for what's in the bottle ever wins the argument. And so Diageo had they stopped making it, but they had all of these barrels of Stitzel-Weller that they didn't really know what to do with. So they were shipping them to Canada, where they were like 2 or 3% of the Crown Royal blend. So like this stuff, and they were just mixing it in with Crown Royal. And Julian got a call from somebody who worked there, who had known him and his father and grandfather, and said, "Look, we got all these barrels for sale. Do you want them?" And they sent him this sheet. And he went and he looked at it and realized what they were, that these are Stitzel-Weller barrels. And he, has funny stories about going around to banks in Kentucky and no one would lend him the money. But, he basically bought as many of these barrels as he could. And to honor what was in the barrels that was going in these bottles, he put his grandfather's picture on the label, and that's where Pappy Van Winkle was born. And, I've always thought that was, I don't know. I mean, to me, knowing that makes it become something more than just a sort of marketing story they tell you. And, the whiskey goes crazy. That's why all of you've heard of it. Got that famous 99, and it becomes this incredibly popular thing. So popular, in fact, that they stopped selling these barrels to Julian and stopped putting it in Crown Royal, because the accountants now realize that we can make money off of this. And so now Julian has a new problem, which, if you're sitting at home doing the math, you can probably figure out, which is, if he is making Pappy Van Winkle out of Stitzel-Weller bourbon, and he can't get any more Stitzel-Weller bourbon, and pretty soon no one will be able to get it because it's going to run out and they're not making any more. And there is no more. There is no more. And so he sort of did the math and realized that, well, once I run out of this whiskey, that's it. So he partnered with Buffalo Trace, who were going to start making a wheated mash bill. I feel dumb saying this to a group of people from Kentucky, but a mash bill is just a list of the grains that go into bourbon. And for the longest time, it was just whatever the farmer had. I mean, people didn't get precious with it until pretty recently. And so, whiskey started out as a way for farmers who lived furthest away from the supply chain to be able to monetize crops before they rotted in the field or rotted on the way to market. And so, one of the reasons that, there was the whiskey rebellion was because, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, I love the fact that it goes back to Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton's trying to figure out how to pay for the Revolutionary War. and he lives in New York City. And so if you live in New York City, whiskey is something people buy in saloons. And so he was like, well, let's just institute a sin tax, because politically no one ever got anywhere by being, for sin. It's a genius political move. Uh, and he was from a city, and so he didn't, that's what it was. And Jefferson tried to explain that the farmer's point of view is that this is actually a tax on the most vulnerable farmers the furthest away from civilization, because whiskey was being made by people whose crops would have rotted before they could be sold otherwise. And so, I love that even, this urban rural divide that we still see so much of, it was at play even then. And I also love that neither of them were wrong. So often we, it feels like one side's right and one side's wrong. And the answer is almost always each side is smartly looking out for their own interest. And I've always thought that was really funny. So, Julian is going to run out of whiskey. He signs up with Buffalo Trace. They're going to make this weeded mash bill. The youngest Pappy is 15 years old. So that, he signed the deal, I think, in 2001. That means it's going to be 2016 before the first of the Buffalo Trace Pappy is ready, which means that at some point the Stitzel-Weller is going to run out and there's going to be a gap. And so, they went and got other weeded bourbons to fill that gap. And then they just had to wait to see if the Buffalo Trace weeded bourbon would live up to their hopes and dreams. I mean, one of Julian's real gifts, as we said before, is his palate. So he's also able to taste young whiskey, and his imagination helps him sort of get a sense of what it might taste like when it's older. He's very good at that. And so he thought he was going to like it, but you never know. I mean, you really never know. And, one of the real poignant things is the Stitzel-Weller bourbon that was in the first Pappy was just a straight up tribute to Pappy. I mean, it was the Stitzel-Weller bourbon. But for Julian, his memory of that bourbon is such an important part of his life. He remembers when he was 16 working at the old distillery out there by the river, and a barrel accidentally got emptied on his head, and he just felt like it was in his pores, and he just has such a strong memory of that smell and taste. And he like the way some people get on the internet and buy a Pappy, he used to get on the internet and buy old bottles of Old Fitzgerald, which was the flagship brand of Stitzel-Weller. Sissy used to really get on him because he'd have a couple of pops and get on the internet and start buying this stuff. And so there's something really beautiful about the fact that what they were going to put in the bottle that was made by Buffalo Trace, as opposed to being the whiskey made at his family's distillery, is the whiskey that is made to satisfy Julian's memory of that whiskey. And so that this new thing was going to be a memory quest if it worked. And so I was with him when he finally tasted that first 15-year-old. And that's sort of the climactic moment of the book, of this person who, one of the things he talks about really poignantly is how fast old whiskey starts to go bad when you take the cork, and how ephemeral it is. It slips through your fingers like sand. And, he talks a lot about, did whiskey make the trip? I mean, I remember we did an event, I think it was a Filson Society event that he did. And I was with him, and he had this really old bourbon that someone had brought that was an old Fitzgerald. And the person, I think, had paid a lot of money for it. Sorry if you're on here. And Julian tasted it, and we got in the car later. You tell he was disappointed because, it had oxidized a little in the bottle, and it didn't taste like his memory of it. His memory of it was better because the whiskey hadn't made the trip. And so it was really poignant to follow him over the course of several years, waiting for this day to arrive, and then have the day arrive. And that's the sort of last act of the book. One of the things that was really powerful to me is in those 4 years waiting for this day to arrive was spending a lot of time in Kentucky. And while I was doing the book, I run a television show for the SEC network called True South. We did a Hodgenville, Kentucky episode, and I made a podcast called Bloodlines that was about the breeding business. And I mean, this is an oversimplification, but basically how there's so much raised in native blood in modern thoroughbreds that there are some people who think that the only way to really save the thoroughbred breed is to destroy it, which is to breed in quarter horses, which would make all of the progeny not actually be thoroughbreds. And so that's there is a small but sort of respected group of thoroughbred geneticists who fear that so much speed has been bred into horses because the really old wealthy families like the Woodwards and the Vanderbilts, who used to own, they didn't own horses so much as they owned gene pools. And now you have there's so much syndication that the sort of quarterly earnings report that drives Wall Street also drives horse breeding. And so there are people who worry that so much speed has been bred into horses to satisfy the needs of syndicates, that they've accidentally ruined the breed, which is a total aside. But I spent a lot of time in Kentucky, and I don't know, I really fell in love with it. I mean, we've flirted a couple of times with, like, we just need to move to Kentucky. Kentucky's incredible. I mean, you got ham, horses, and whiskey. I don't really know, what else there is in the world. And so, one of the things I was thinking about over the last couple of days, thinking about what to say to you, is, there's a horse farm out there on that road, like going from Lexington out to Paris, and you have to get the owners to let you in, but it used to be the biggest and most powerful horse farm in the world. They used to have these Kentucky Derby parties out there that are the stuff of legend. And now there are, I think five big columns of what used to be this house, just standing out in the middle of a horse field overlooking pastures. And like, that image stuck with me writing this book, because America is such a new country that most other countries are used to the idea of ruins and physical reminders of things that used to be, and we're just not used to that. We're too young, we're not used to that. And so being out there around American ruins is sort of jarring and shaking, and yet it's also really beautiful, because you imagine the worlds that were, and you start to realize that just because something was tall, just because something was big and powerful and strong, doesn't mean that it's going to last forever. And I thought a lot about that, about this bourbon, because yes, the operation at Stitzel-Weller is gone. I mean, the grain grinders are gone, and the yeast is gone. Although Julian thinks the yeast is in a freezer in New Jersey, which is funny. I love to think of it's like the end of Indiana Jones. I just imagine that down some hallway in some big conglomerate's storage facility, there is this yeast in the back corner of a freezer that once made the world's greatest bourbon. But the memory of it remains, and in the memory it is reborn. And Pappy is not worth what they sell it for in the secondary market. I think Julian would tell you that. But there are, to me, really romantic and powerful and important ideas about home in each of those bottles, because of the love, memory, luck, and dedication, and stick-to-itiveness that was required for it to exist at all. And I'm sure there are lots of different other bourbon labels that have similar stories, but when I have a glass of really great whiskey like this, frankly, I like to think about everything it took for this to arrive here, and how many people's memories and hopes and dreams are in the bottle. I book is Pappyland. It's available wherever books are sold. That's my shill. And I think we'll bring back Patrick, and would love to ask questions until you don't have any more, and about anything you want to talk about. But I'm really grateful you all showed up and listened, and this was a real privilege. And I also hope we can do it again once we can do these things in person, because your reputation extends far beyond the boundaries of Kentucky. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Wright. That was really fantastic. And yeah, please, everybody who's watching, if you do have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll read them. I'll start off with a couple of mine. I was taking notes because there were some great thoughts that you threw out there about the nature of the South and nostalgia and feeling, and those are things that manifest in my own historical work. As a historian, my sort of academic work is trying to figure out Kentucky, because I'm still trying to figure out my place in the world fundamentally. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sort of understanding of Kentucky as it fits in with the South, as a piece of the Upper South here, and how that relates, and how bourbon is this thing that can link the region.
I mean, it's interesting because Kentucky wasn't really the South until after the Civil War. I mean, Charles Reagan Wilson at Ole Miss, who's a real, he's probably the preeminent scholar on lost cause mythology. It was a border state, and there were 100,000 Kentuckians who fought for the Union and 30,000 Kentuckians who fought for the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln is from Kentucky. He's from Hodgenville. And, there's that great Churchill quote that the Irish remember the defeats long after the English have forgotten the victories. And that's exactly what happened in Kentucky. That, after the war, all the people who'd won just went about their lives and making money. But the folks who lost, as Charles Reagan Wilson talked about, the war was called a holy war from pulpits and the mouths of politicians. And how do you reconcile having lost a holy war? And so, I mean, that would mean that God isn't on your side. And so there was Kentucky didn't really become Southern in the popular imagination until well after the war. And that's really interesting, because there isn't a living human being right now who, if you asked, is Kentucky in the South, no one would say no. And, yet it wasn't. And so, I mean, I think that's another, we're talking about the Elmendorfer farm and those columns. I mean, I think that's another example of how, when people say history will judge, that's one of the craziest things you can say, because you have no idea how history will be changed by whatever happens in the future. History is very malleable, always up for grabs. And I just find that really interesting. So, I mean, that was something that was interesting to me about Kentucky, because when I didn't know that, I would have told you Kentucky has always been Southern, and, it really wasn't.
Yeah, no, that rings really true. We got some great questions coming in the chat right now, so I'll put off mine aside. Do you have a comment about the current cult status that the bourbon's achieved? We have an example. Old Forester's birthday bourbon is releasing on Thursday, and people are camping outside. What's led to that?
Well, I mean, I think, I guess partly I'm looking at that question. I mean, what's led to it is people like stuff they can't have. I mean, my thoughts are, one, I'm never camping out for a bourbon. I mean, I guess I understand it if the point isn't the bourbon, if the point is you and your friends, it's this thing you do. And so it's fun to go tailgate. It's like flying to Red Rocks for a concert. It is a patently absurd thing to do if you're just going to hear music, because once the lights go down, it doesn't really matter where you are. But if the whole deal is because it's difficult, because it's a quest and this thing that you and a group of friends do, and you get joy, camaraderie, and memory of the quest, and then every time you drink from that bottle, you relive it and those bonds are formed anew, that I get. uh, I think. But, you know, the allocation process is insane. You know, people ask me, like, I get these things now all the time since the book came out. You know, my buddy's getting married. My buddy got a promotion. You know, I want to give my buddy a really nice bottle of whiskey. And I always say the same thing. And I'm like, look, go get a really nice decanter with their initials on it. And if they like wheated bourbon, go get them a bottle of Maker's Mark. And if they like rye bourbons, go get a bottle of Wild Turkey. And like, you know, but that's just me. I mean, the allocation process is not, I mean, people send me this stuff like this is someone's barrel pick. But I mean, you know, I don't save it. If bottle of whiskey arrives at my house, I'm opening it. You know, I have no collection. I mean, you know, I don't have a bottle of Van Winkle in this house because we drank it all.
Absolutely. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about with now the involvement of Buffalo Trace. Is there what's the sort of Van Winkle family relationship?
So it's they have an agreement where the control of the company is still in the family's hands, and so it's Julian, and then if they're Louisville people there, I'm sure people know Preston and then triplets, and so they'll be coming along afterwards. And you know, Preston has a really great palate. I mean, Julian thinks Preston's palate is better than his. It's interesting because it's different. And so I love the idea that that Pappy will evolve based on Preston's memory quest. I mean, there's something beautiful about that. If it's incredibly boring to have something and just try to keep it the same. Like as long as they're like really strict standards, which they are. I mean, I used to just shake my head when they would dump barrels of really great whiskey because it didn't live up to the standard. I'm like, you guys are out of your minds. You're just lighting money on fire. So as long as they're rigorous standards, I think it's good when things evolve.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some other projects you've kind of got in the hopper. Is Kentucky going to feature anywhere? What else are you writing?
No, Kentucky really isn't. I mean, I'm currently writing a story on Mike Krzyzewski, so I think that's the anti-Kentucky story. I did learn how to spell it to do that because the trick is Crazy Zewski, KRZYZEWSKI. And I have bad news for the people in Kentucky because he's hilarious. He's a really funny, good
We didn't
dude.
need to know that.
I know I'm really sorry to have to be the one to tell you. You know, he's just hilarious. His brother was a fireman in Chicago for 38 years, retired as a captain, big union guy, and so when Mike would go up there recruiting, he'd always go eat dinner at the firehouse. And he has these hilarious stories because those guys at the firehouse could give a crap that he won basketball games. But anyway, no Kentucky at this time.
Well, a very important one. What are your favorite places to go watch a horse race?
Wow. I mean, I like Keeneland a lot. I like the fairgrounds in New Orleans a lot. I like Churchill Downs. I mean, it used to be Oaks Day, but now Thurby is like one of the all-time great days. I also had like the best. I won a lot of money a couple of Thurbies ago, and that doesn't really happen. And so I have very fond memories of just like, I felt like an arms dealer or some sort of like drug dealer. I just had an incredible amount of cash in my pockets. So that was super fun. We went up to what's that, Patrick's Liquor Bar in Louisville, and I just started buying drinks for strangers. It was great. I think about that like, is it the Doobie Brothers, the line, I'll be buying everybody drinks all over town. Yeah, I was spending that money like I wanted at a horse track. So I have very fond memories of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll add my own since you mentioned ham, horses, and bourbon. Where are you going for the best country ham, and or do you have a go-to if you're looking for it outside of the state? I'm a Trigg County, and keep in mind.
Well, I am, and I understand that this might get me thrown off the call. And so, by the way, if they kick me off, it's been a real pleasure. I mean, Scott's sitting there right now with his finger on the eject goose. I'm an Alan Benton guy. I like Alan. I mean, I like all country ham though. That's, I can't ever take any of my rings off because of it, but I am a very big fan of it.
The correct answer was my cousin Betty's.
Yeah. Did you like how I dodged that? That's good.
Yeah. We got a question in here about what was the cost per barrel of that old Stitzel-Weller was going for?
I don't know, but I think it will make you vomit. I mean, I think it was a couple $100.
Yeah, I kind of
I mean, and by the way, if a banker in Kentucky would have loaned him $10 million, that banker would be flying around on a Gulf Stream.
Yeah, absolutely. Following up on the horse race question, what's the next concert you're planning to go to?
That's a good question. I think I'm going, one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm making a documentary about music, about rhythm and sports with Mickey Hart, who was the drummer in the Grateful Dead, who's now the drummer in Dead & Co. So it'll probably be a Dead & Co. show. I was up there at Shea, whatever the hell they call Shea Stadium now. But I was up there for that. So it'll probably be that, which is work.
That's the life, ain't it?
Yeah. Oh, here I'm reading this one.
Yeah.
Oh, they grew up a few blocks from the Stitzel-Weller distillery on Fitzgerald Road. That is correct. I try very hard at these events to avoid saying the word shively because I've never known if it was shively or shively. I think shively.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's good. But I try to avoid that so I don't look dumber than I already look. But no, the smell of whiskey in a distillery is something. I mean, it's really, I love driving out. Here's your fun fact of the day. There are no turns between Maker's Mark and the monastery where Thomas Merton lived. It is, you take a left out of the distillery and a left into the monastery.
A long time since I've been down there, but yeah.
If you're a Merton nut, I go on a lot of Thomas Merton riffs in this book. I'm always been sort of obsessed with Will Campbell and Thomas Merton, but there's a lot of searching for faith questions here. It was funny, writing a book about somebody gives you license to do things that are just not socially appropriate. So like one day I just texted Julian. I was like, do you believe in God? Yeah. Let's see what happens here, And so, but anyway, there's a lot of that in there, trying to sort all that out.
Following up, making some odd connections. Let's follow that theme. How does a guy who loves bourbon and horses also love Argentina and soccer, though? I would point out there's a strong equestrian tradition in Argentina. What's the connection?
Well, I mean, Kentucky is liquor, sports, and meat. And Argentina is liquor, sports, and meat. Argentina does have better pizza, I will say. But I mean, Argentina's fun. I really like it.
I was doing some research on, in 1956, some Cubans bought the Louisville Colonels, and it didn't last long because of the revolution, but there's some sugar barons and they wanted to buy a baseball team. So they bought the Colonels. And the Courier Journal sent a reporter down to Havana and had this really wonderful lifestyle story where they were like, well, come to find out, these guys are just like us. Because why? They live out on rural plantations. They like to ride and shoot and drink. These guys are going to fit right in Kentucky. Yeah,
that didn't work out so good for them down there.
Boy, it sure didn't. That's a story that I mean to write some other day. But no, there's a lot to link that up.
What's your research about?
So I'm a historian of Civil War and Reconstruction, but I wrote a biography of a conservative unionist, so union officer, slave-owning union officer, who resigns in protest of the Emancipation Proclamation and sort of is the face of this Confederatizing shift after the war.
It's interesting. I just read a thing that a West Point guy wrote that was about the difference between the North's use of the railroad and the South's use of the railroad in the Civil War, and basically how sophisticated the Union Army was, because you know, I mean, I never really thought about this. I'm not a military person. This guy wrote this, who's a retired general and a historian, is a friend of mine, and we were talking, and he was like, you know, the only U.S. military officers who resigned their commission to join the Confederacy were, you know, some high-profile generals. But like the actual people that make an army go, nobody in the South could be bothered with that. And so like all of the, like there's a whole interesting tradition about how they were all into having really nice uniforms and sabers, but nobody actually wanted to do the hard logistical work of making sure that every horse had 13 pounds of hay to eat a day. And so like there's this hilarious military theory that they were military reenactors as it was happening. That like, you know, that you go back and look and just be like, you know, Lincoln nationalized the railroad day one and Jefferson Davis never did. And so the South could never move supplies. And so that just the West Point trained bean counters, who were the best in the world, always had their army met at the exact right moment with trains full of bullets and food. And you know, the South, I was going to say we, you know, the South could never get it done, could just never actually do the work required, but they love to give speeches and wave swords.
Oh, there's so much Walter Scott just flowing through their heads, and they're all just living a romantic novel.
No, it is. It's just like no one was actually interested in winning a war.
Yeah. No, I definitely hear that. And I keep thinking about John Castleman, who's a figure in Louisville, whose monument has caused some controversy in recent years. But he's a Confederate cavalryman with John Hunt Morgan, and sort of in the midst of the most romantic thing. And he and his guys, as they're running off to join the Confederate Army, get into a gunfight in the family cemetery with, you know, some Unionist cousins. And they're there, and he sets it to some romantic poetry in his memoir, and man, ain't that the thing?
By the way, I mean, just a gunfight with your own family in the family cemetery.
At the best.
Maybe they were logistically brilliant. Like if you guys are gonna shoot each other, that's where you should do it.
That's right. Yeah. They were creating the narrative, right?
Well, there you go. Just forget everything I just said. That's genius.
I want to try and link back up to sports, though, because I find this really fascinating, this thread that runs through your work, and this question of family and ancestors and ghosts. And, you know, do you find that these same sorts of drives, you know, sort of that push that athletes that you write about are also pushing people like the Van Winkles?
You know, I think the thing that anybody who's great at something, whether it's Michael Jordan or Julian Van Winkle or John Calipari or anybody, I think you'll find that they're living 6 inches in front of their face. And that, you know, somebody told me one time, like, Zen is a butt in a seat. You know, it's just doing the work over and over and over again. I mean, I certainly find, one of the worst things about having a book come out is you spend so much time talking about doing something and so little time doing it, that when it comes time to go do it again, it seems like you're like, I can't believe I used to work like this. And it takes you a while to sort of get back into sort of what it takes. And like, I certainly felt that. I mean, you know, you go on a book tour, it's, you know, it's a joke. You just, every night you talk about yourself and then eat and drink. I mean, it's you know, it is every egomaniac's crack rock. And like, you know, and then when you go back into a room alone again, you're just like, this sucks. And, you know, I think that the people who are really great at something are the ones who are able to always go be alone again and do the work.
Yeah, no, I hear that. We've got a very selfish question on behalf of the Filson. We're a research organization. We want to bring in the archives, the papers, the manuscripts that are going to help us tell Kentucky's story generations from now. Who are the people? What are the themes? What are the storylines the Filson needs to be watching out for in modern Kentucky that we can leave a historical record for the historians of the future?
I mean, it's interesting how, their barbecue traditions, like down the south of the state, which are shoulders cut across the bone on band saws and then cooked on like charcoal fires with this really spicy sauce. And like, I love to go eat those. But one of the things that you realize is, that was working class food of a tribe that almost no longer exists. So much of what we consider Southern food is former working class food that is now the way the descendants of those hard scrabble people, it's the way we commune with them. And so the real tacos, the new biscuits, and breakfast tacos, the new biscuits, and tacos are the new barbecue. And so Kentucky, like even like the food culture, for instance, is evolving in real time. And whether it's Sri Lankan fried chicken in Lexington, Sam Four, I don't know how many people have had our fried chicken, but like that is undeniably Kentucky. And yet it is also deeply rooted in her Sri Lankan background. And so, if you are thinking of Kentucky history as William Woodward's Nashua and, colonels in white suits, I think you're sort of missing the fact that it's evolving in real time. And that, that's interesting. I mean, it's also interesting to me how Bardstown is turning into the new Napa Valley, maybe. I mean, I don't know that it's going to, but I certainly think that's what the big sort of private equity money that is flowing into their hopes. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. But it is interesting to me that oh, sorry, I almost called 911 on my phone. It is interesting to me to see what happens there. All the state counties going wet is really interesting because the politics of I love the cornbread mafia because like in a certain, when you go back to sort of thinking about bourbon as the way that farmers on the very fringes of society could get their crops to market without them rotting, what's the difference between growing wheat for bourbon, growing tobacco for cigarettes, and growing pot? And I think there are a lot of people who, you go up to Hardin County and they'll tell you the answer is none. And so, I mean, I think that's really interesting. That like, I love to go, what is that? Oh my God, it's that town in between Bardstown and Hodgenville that has all those liquor stores. Cause it's that county line right there between LaRue and whatever county I'm bad on this, but like right there at the LaRue County line, there is that town that has all of those liquor stores, because that used to be the first wet county all the way to the Tennessee border. And so like, that's really interesting to me as these towns are going wet to try to capitalize on the bourbon boom. LaRue just went wet last year. I think it passed about 10 votes. And so that's really interesting as towns try to grapple. LaRue used to have 50 dairy farmers. There are none now. There's not a single dairy farmer in LaRue County. The last one went out of business like 14 months ago. And so, I mean, that's really interesting. So I don't know. Those are a couple of things off the top of my head.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm gonna hit you up for some more collections development advice down the line. I think we've run through all our questions. I've really enjoyed this. Wright Thompson, thank you so much. The book is Pappyland. I know I'm going to pick up a copy and read, and I think everybody else should.
Thank you so much. This was really, really fun, and I appreciate all of your time And big thanks to Patrick and especially to Scott Scarborough for setting all this up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all. Everybody have a good night.